It's great to be with you today. My name is Ross Thompson. I'm not Lee, I'm not the preacher, but he asked me to share. We've had a great series in the last month on families. And, you know, one of the key components, I think, to a great family are friendships. So today what I'd like to do is focus a little bit on that. To help with my illustration, I want to share a little bit of my childhood, which was kind of unusual. I grew up as a young child in the inner city in L.A. Used to ride my bike in the L.A. River. Anyone know what the L.A. River is? Raise your hand. The concrete that they always do films in. And then we moved to Iowa on the Mississippi. And, you know, obviously there were some challenges, but one of the greatest things about that move was made some great friends. In fact, today I still have some of those friends. We were only there a couple years, but one of the things that happened was I had this young friend. I was 10 years old. His name was John. He was a stocky young man because he grew up on a farm. So city kid going to the farm, and he would invite me out to the farm a lot. And as a city kid, I didn't have the right clothes. You know, so they gave me overalls, and they kept those overalls for me whenever I came to visit. And one of the things that was really striking to me as I reflected on the message today was really not John, but his parents. They both were hardworking. I would call them farmer strong. You know, they were always out doing what needed to be done on the farm, but then when they came in, it was a celebration, and part of that was, you know, shepherd's pie and other kinds of things that I had never experienced. But part of it was also how I think John's father, Mr. Wolf, how manly he was. And one of the things that strikes me often as we look at Jesus is how we look at him as a sheep and not the lion, just like we were singing earlier. And so I started thinking about the idea of farmer strong, carpenter strong. We have a member, he was here this morning, but I didn't get to pick him out. There's a number of people that work with their hands in our congregation. And just this morning I was shaking one of their hands and realizing this is a man, right? This isn't a boy, this isn't city slicker, this is a man. And so it really translates when I think about Jesus, because we see him with his friends interacting and things, and we don't see him like that, I think, a lot. So let's keep in mind Jesus is carpenter strong. Then the second idea I want to talk about is feet. Ray gives me a great illustration because he's usually in flip-flops. Earlier when he was practicing, he was barefoot. I wish he had stayed that way. That would have been even better. So when he comes back up, pay attention to his feet. You know, our feet are amazing because on one hand they bear the load of the day, but on the other hand they're the most sensitive part of our body. A quarter of our bones are in our feet. They're the most ticklish because part of the body that has it has 8,000 nerves in it. At the end of the day, in case you're worried why your shoes don't fit, it's because they swell. During an average day of walking, the forces on your feet can total hundreds of tons, equivalent to an average of a fully loaded cement truck. So we don't think about that. It always puzzled me a little bit how our feet can do that. I never got a clear answer when I was doing my research. It's just one of the amazing things about God and his creation. So imagine Jesus, this carpenter strong guy, asking his disciples to wash their feet. It was more than just a ceremony. He was connecting with them in a really special way. And then the story gets colorful because I think it really illustrates how men relate to one another, because he gets to Peter, one of his closest friends, and you know what Peter says? Do you know the story? He says, "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." So Jesus is serious, right? I don't think Peter was here. Because then he says, "Then Lord, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. So I think he's kind of joking with Jesus, saying, all right, if you're going to wash my feet, you might as well wash all of me, right? Now, the interesting thing also is, if you look at your hands and your hair, they're also the most sensitive parts of our body. So to me, it really got me thinking about how close Jesus was to his disciples, but especially to Peter. So then I started talking to a couple friends about fishing. Any of you fishermen out here? Fishers? A few? All right, so if you talk to a real fisherman, this is what you get when you ask them, what do you need to be a good fisherman? You need to pay attention to the time that you fish, to the tides, the bait, finding where the fish are staged, the moon phases, the lure. You get the idea? There's a lot involved. I talked to Lee about it a little bit because he likes to fish, and he gave me a list this long. It's like a summary for a book about fishing. So with this idea of Jesus, carpenter strong, now the fisherman, he is coming across, and in Luke 5:4 he says, when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon Peter, "Put out into the deep water and let down the net for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything." So he knows better, right? Because he's the real fisherman. "But because you say so, I will let down the net." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their net began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partner in the business. And then Jesus goes on to say, "Don't be afraid, for now on you will fish for people." So the first thing to think about regarding friendships, you imagine Jesus coming along, not really known as a fisherman, and then knowing where the fish are. And we can think of that kind of miraculously, but I wondered if he just paid attention. And I think that's the first thing to understand about friends, because a friend knows his friend's business, right? So if you care about someone you're close to, you're going to get into what they're into. And I think that's a good illustration here. And then the second thing is he calls his friend to a higher purpose and to inspire him toward it. So Jesus isn't just settling for who they are, but he's calling them out to be more than that. And clearly that's illustrated here in that story. So there's all these great stories. And really, as I was preparing for this, I probably could have listed 20 stories. But there's a few I'm going to pick out that I think really illustrate Jesus and Peter. Peter then came to him in a storm, attempting to walk on water. So Peter probably thought, well, if Jesus can do it, I can do it, right, with the fish. So Jesus is walking across the water, and he goes to join him, but he really can't. He starts sinking. So the next idea for friends is that a friend is going to lift us up when we're in trouble. Sometimes we get in trouble because we're trying to keep up with somebody else or trying to do what they can do. A true friend is going to join in trying to help, and that's clearly what Jesus did there. He lifted him out of the water. And then in Matthew 16:6, Jesus uses Peter to reveal he is the Messiah. So why is that significant? You know the scripture, right? Who do you say I am? And that's when Jesus for the first time when Peter for the first time names Jesus. Well, I think that Jesus was purposeful about this, because now there's going to be a shift from him to his disciples. So I believe that with his friend, he was trying to honor him. So a good friend is going to give his friends an opportunity to be honored and to be recognized. And then in Matthew 16:22, this was, I'm sure, kind of a stark situation for Peter, because he has this buddy-buddy relationship with Jesus. And then Jesus starts declaring that he's going to be leaving them. He's going to be taken away. And Peter is saying, I'm not going to let that happen. You're not going to do that. So Peter couldn't really face the reality of the situation. Jesus, and you see this through the story of Jesus, he's sharing with them ahead of time what's going to go on. But they didn't really get it. They didn't really believe it. So I think a good friend challenges us not to think of ourselves, not to think of the things that we want to have happen, but to think of God first. And certainly that's what Jesus did. He thought about God first. He was calling out Peter to do the same thing. And then there's this neat little story in Matthew 17:5. And I didn't really remember this, but there was a point where Jesus took a few of his disciples up to a mountaintop. And there was a point where God was revealed to all the disciples that were there. And Peter was thrilled with that. But on a friend level, we know we're friends when we're introduced to family, right? So here's a story about Jesus going to Papa, really, because God said, this is my son who I'm pleased with, and introducing his friends to them. And so I think that's kind of cool. And then Matthew 26:33. All the time as men, and I recognize this a lot, working with a lot of men in my counseling, that we don't want to give in to our weakness. We don't want to acknowledge our weaknesses, right? So who's better to call us out on those weaknesses than our friends? And that's here, I think, what's happening in Matthew 26:33. Peter couldn't accept his vulnerability when Jesus said, you're going to deny me. And he basically said, there's no way I'm going to do that. So he's calling his friend out because he knows that that's going to happen. So we are all blessed by our friends, and sometimes they catch us ahead of time, and then we don't make the mistake, But sometimes we don't pay attention, we don't acknowledge, and then we make the mistake, and then we remember, that my friend told me that was going to happen. Prior to that happening, though, in John 18:10, the story is sad, really, because that's the point when Jesus is taken, right? And he had been praying in the garden. He took his friends with him again. And as he's praying, they're falling asleep. I believe they didn't really get how serious the situation was. They thought that this was just another time in the garden with their friend Jesus. Then the soldiers come to take him. So now here's Peter. We kind of got introduced to him. And what does he do? He strikes the ear off of one of the soldiers, right? I think that's an interesting story because Jesus is the one who is struggling, right? But Peter is drawing the attention to him. And I think that happens sometimes too with our friends. One friend is struggling, the other one gets in trouble, and then the one friend who's struggling has to jump in. And that's kind of what happened here. I wonder if with the soldiers, if Jesus hadn't healed the ear, if they would have arrested Peter too. I think that might be a fair assumption, but he heals the ear when he's at the worst time because he's being taken. Then as he's taken in Matthew 26:75, Jesus endured probably the worst thing that a friend can endure. Now, he had anticipated it coming, but that's where Peter denied him. And so, imagine that. Imagine you're the one that's suffering again, and you turn to your friend, and your friend is walking away. He's denying you. He's not recognizing you, right? And so, what I think is very important there is that Jesus didn't look at Peter out of his behavior. He didn't take it personally. All of us would have taken that personally, for sure. And if you can think of a time when a friend has offended you, that's the first thing we tend to do is say, hey, this is about me. They hurt me. What we see really quickly in John 21:4, in Mark 16:7, is Peter was singled out when Jesus was raised again. So one of the first things that happens when Jesus is raised is the angel proclaims Jesus and says, go tell Peter and his disciples. So Jesus isn't holding a grudge, is he? This is where I'm used to being a counselor. People actually respond back, when I throw something out, So, no, he's not holding a grudge. He's right away, he sees the context. And then he's able to forgive his friend. And you see that illustrated here. So this whole story with him and Peter kind of wraps up in John 21. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. Well, what is he doing here? He repeated the miracle that he had done before. He had appeared to the disciples, but they didn't recognize him initially. And then he said, cast your net. And then they catch a big fish. So they realize, oh, this is Jesus again. Peter even jumps in the water again to go meet him. And what's Jesus doing? He's cooking for him. So he's gathering his friends. And I kind of picture this like a time of reflection, where he's sharing about how much they'd been through together. Could you imagine? Have you ever sat around a campfire like that? And the friend that is the one who's gone through the struggle is the one who's serving. So then he tells them to come and have breakfast. None of them would ask, who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord at that point. And he took the bread and gave it to them and did the same with the fish. This was the third time Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time. Now, you know that there's a dynamic there, right? Right? In all the stories that I shared, Jesus knows Peter better than he does, right? So he's just wanting to repeat the message. Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. So in this part of the story, three things happened. He reflected on the good of their life together. He served them as a host. So even at this point in his life, Jesus has this attitude of hospitality, serving others. And then he called all of us really to love other people. The command in John 15:12 says, my command is this, love each other as I have loved you. I think about all the people in my life, and in this room there's a lot of them. I'm really pleased to have visitors and those that I've known for many years as well as recently. The truth is, not one of the people I think about as my friends meet up to Jesus' standard. But when I think about everybody together, I think they come pretty close. And it's an amazing thing to think about how God gifts us with the friends that we have. I think in all these ways that I talked about, recently I was with my grandma who's 102, and she's frail, but she has never been frail in my life until, once she crossed 100, you can give her a break, right, for that? So I'm sitting there holding her hand, and especially for my family that's here, if you know her, she was friends to everybody around her. That continued through the end of her life living in Arcadia. So I asked her for sage advice about friendship, and she says really profoundly, it takes one to know one. So finally, what I like to do is just recognize, sometimes God gives us with friends that are really easy to get along with. sometimes not so much, but it's the collection of all of them, really, that make life worthwhile to us. I think about Sharon. She's put up with a lot, being married to me for 30 years. She remembers me as the hippie kid from California, and then all the other friends that have been in my life. So just like Jesus is asking us to love his sheep, we need to love one another like that, and especially people that we're just getting to know, that he wants us to seek out other people and to be able to serve. Finally, I want to share a story. It is Memorial Day weekend. Sharon and I had a great opportunity 30 years ago to work with a youth group in a church near here. And one of the youth, his name was Kyle. And Kyle was an adventurous kid. In fact, one day in our youth activity, we kind of left him a little bit unattended, right? And he decided to jump from one table. So he got on a table, then he jumped from one to the other table. He thought he could jump across. He didn't make it, cut his eye open. The mom was called. She kind of gave me a little bit of a comeuppance about supervising her son, right? So Kyle was an adventurer. He also later on became a soldier, and he served 3 tours in Iraq. The last one, he had been a rescue swimmer type person, and then he decided to shift and go in the Army and became a helicopter pilot. And I remember running into him at the public shopping center, talking to him about what he really was excited about doing, and he wanted to do that. So he ended up doing that and served over there until he was shot down and killed. And so for many of us, we have people in our lives that we really honor and we respect for their service, but also those that we've lost. And so what I like to do is say a prayer now to recognize those that have served us and those that have been lost. Let's go to God.